the 8th Virginia Regiment, but that's easy to say because I think I'm the only expert on the 8th Virginia Regiment. So it's not all that impressive. Now, I am mindful, though, that I am in a room full of people who live here in the Shenandoah Valley, unlike me, who are interested in their local history. So there may, in fact, be another expert in the room. If I say something wrong, don't be polite. Tell me I'm wrong, okay? So I'm going to talk about Abraham Bowman today, a name that I know is familiar to all of you, at least to some extent. He is like a lot of Shenandoah Valley Revolutionary War heroes in that he was from here, grew up here, joined the Continental Army here, but then moved away after the war. And so a lot of these guys aren't as well remembered locally as they ought to be because they lived most of their lives in Kentucky or somewhere else. So I'm going to tell you about a local boy who made good but moved away. I am going to ask for a couple of volunteers during my presentation. I'm going to ask, I think, 6 people if they would be willing to read something. So just like the Continental Army, if we don't have volunteers, we might have to draft. So think carefully about which scenario you would prefer. Fantastic. I'll get to you. So a little bit about me. I am a Yankee. I was born in Colorado, grew up in Pennsylvania. We have a town in Pennsylvania called Strasburg. So if I say Strasburg,
Pronunciation.
What's that?
That's wrong.
Yeah, I know. I'm apologizing beforehand. So if I say Strasburg, you can glare at me, but just yell at me afterwards. I know it's Strasburg. In fact, Tim's the one who told me when I met him at the museum. So I apologize for my Yankee origins and all the baggage I carry from being like that. So I'll try to make up for it today. So today we're going to talk about Abraham Bowman. As you can see from the top of this plaque in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, he lived an important life. And he is well remembered in Kentucky, but less well remembered here. Although I gather last time you all met, you heard an amazing story about him when he was a teenager. But there's a whole lot more about him that you all need to know about, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. Just a little bit more about me. I have this website. I also have a Facebook page and a YouTube channel. There's not a whole lot on the YouTube channel. I think we'll put this up there if I perform well today. The Facebook page, I don't know how many of you are on Facebook, but I schedule things. So something's posted every day. So that you might want to sign up for that. And the website, it's blog posts and articles, and there's a roster of soldiers and lots of stuff up there. The 8th Virginia Regiment is my focus. I'll tell you a little bit more about the regiment itself when we get to that part of the presentation. Abraham Bowman was one of 13 children. He was the child of George Bowman and Mary Height. If you know anything about local history, you know the Height name is very important. 11 of those 13 children survived to adulthood. Mary, his mother, was the daughter of Jost Height, the very early German settler of the Shenandoah Valley, who came from Pennsylvania. This is a house in Pennsylvania, I don't know, maybe 30 miles northwest of Philadelphia, that is today known as Pennypacker Mills. It was the home of Governor Pennypacker in the 19th century. But the oldest part of this house was Jost Height's house. And still stands. The kitchen and one other room are original. I can't tell you which part it is by looking at this picture, but this is where the Height family came from in Pennsylvania. As you probably know, the Tidewater and Piedmont, Virginia establishment was eager to have the Shenandoah Valley settled so that they would have somebody between them and the Indians, and between them and the French. And so they welcomed these people to come down from Pennsylvania and settle out in this area. And the Heights and the Bowmans were amongst the first to come. Of the 11 surviving children in the Bowman family, here are 4 who are on this plaque in Harrodsburg, Kentucky. They were born over a lot of years. Abraham was not the oldest, but 4 of them were very prominent in Kentucky history and are on this plaque in Harrodsburg. I won't tell you too much about the other 3, just that John Bowman was a very important military frontier leader in Kentucky, born and raised here. Abraham we're going to focus on today. Joseph Bowman served under George Rogers Clark and was killed, I think at the Battle of Vincennes, or one of those key Western battles. Isaac Bowman was a captain in the Vincennes expedition as well. There are a couple of local historic markers I'm sure you are all very familiar with. One is an old one that dates back I don't know how many decades, and one that I just stumbled upon and is evidently new. I expect somebody in this room had something to do with it getting put up. But the Bowman family was a big deal around here back in the day. This is the house that Abraham grew up in. I expect once again that many of you are familiar with the house. It's usually called Harmony Hall, I guess. There are people living in it. I would love to go see it sometime, but it's a little bit remote. It was also called Fort Bowman, as indicated on the sign here. That is because during the French and Indian War, houses were often fortified or semi-fortified in case of Indian attack or other dangers. The actual Fort Bowman, I gather, was probably not this house. There was probably a wood house built before it, a log house. This house evidently isn't quite as old as people thought originally. Somebody here might know more about that than I do. And if there is, I want to hear about it. Bowman's Mill Road, I bet you've all driven on it many, many times. That is named after the mill that George Bowman had, Abraham's father. I gather that there were 2 mills. There was an original mill and a later mill. These are the ruins of, I think, the second mill. The property owner let me take a picture from a distance. During the French and Indian War, Abraham was a teenager. When the war ended, there was a short conflict called Pontiac's Rebellion. This was, the war was over as far as the French were concerned, but not as far as the Indians were concerned. And so the violence continued. And the story of the Miller Bible dates from this period, maybe even a little bit after Pontiac's Rebellion was technically over. So the way the story goes, and I know that you've heard this before, there was an alarm, as they would refer to it, and the neighborhood forted up at Fort Bowman. So once again, this is probably a log house with a makeshift stockade around it. I don't think we know precisely. Amongst the people who were forted up were George Miller and his family, John and Rachel Dellinger, who were evidently newlyweds. She may have been pregnant. If she wasn't, she was soon going to be pregnant. And as they were forted up in this small enclosure, this guy Abraham Mitchell, some sort of local scoundrel, I don't think we know much about him, was caught stealing something. Well, they took care of it and they punished him. They tied him to a whipping post. Now, I'm going to pause and say there are 2 sources for this. One of them is the Kercheval history, the history of the Valley of Virginia, which dates to 1833, is based on verbal accounts and is most authoritative. John Walter Wayland has a slightly different account in his history of the Valley, history of Shenandoah County. That's where it says he was tied to a whipping post. I don't know what his source of information is for that. But whatever the details, Mitchell was caught stealing and punished somehow. He was humiliated. When the alarm was over, he took off, and a year later showed up with 8 Indians. They murdered the entire Mitchell family, or Miller family, except for the youngest daughter who was sick and in the house. She watched her whole family get tomahawked and shot to death as they were out in the garden. She jumped out the back window, ran to the nearest neighbor's house. Nobody was home. She ran to the Bowman house, and teenage Abraham was home. He had just ridden by the Miller house and was a little bit skeptical. that what she was telling him was true. But nonetheless, he hopped on his horse and grabbed his rifle and rode out there, and he found the Miller family. It's very gruesome, I apologize. They weren't quite dead yet. They were writhing around in the ground in pools of blood, slowly dying. There's nothing they could do for them. They went to the house, and the Indians had taken the family Bible, opened it, I think to 2 Samuel, certainly at random, set it on fire, murdered the family cat, and thrown the cat on top of the Bible. This is like a scene from a horror movie, right? It's creepy and evil. I guess the cat put out the fire, and the Bible survived, and it is at the Strasburg Museum. Did I say it right, ma'am? Yeah. All right. So they chased the Indians out past Moorfield. Then Mitchell and the Indians went and attacked the Dellingers, killed Mr. Dellinger, took Mrs. Dellinger and their baby captive, and then headed out past Moorfield. The baby was a burden, so they killed it. The pursuers caught up with them, killed one of the Indians, liberated Rachel, but the rest of them got away. And it was Rachel who identified Abraham Mitchell. So here's the Bible. I don't know how many people get to go in and say, can I look inside the Bible? Tim very graciously let me take some pictures. I never touched it. Tim did the touching. But you can see how it was burned there. There are, I guess that's wax paper between the leaves to prevent further damage. But this is a real treasure. I mean, this is from the 1760s. The Bible is probably decades older than that. There's an amazing story connected with it. It is a real treasure. You were all really blessed to have that local and available to you. So moving on from that period, and by the way, Tim, I'm not really looking at my time, so if I'm going too slow, just do that, okay? Fast forwarding about a decade, at the time of all of that stuff, Dunmore County, which is now Shenandoah County, Dunmore County was still part of Frederick County. Both in church architecture, the parish, the Anglican Church of England parish was Frederick Parish, and the county was Frederick County. In 1769, the parish was split, and Beckford Parish was created, and then following the exact same geographical boundaries, Dunmore County was created in 1772. James Wood, a name that might be familiar to all of you, he was a leader in Frederick County. He recruited Peter Muhlenberg to come down and become the rector of Beckford Parish. He was a Lutheran, which wasn't allowed, so he had to travel all the way to London to get ordained in the Church of England, and then came to be the rector of Beckford Parish, preaching at various places, but headquartered in Woodstock. When the county was established, Abraham became one of the original members of the county court. Now that doesn't mean that he was a judge, although the title was Justice of the Peace. It was there was no separation of powers back then. It was executive power and judicial power. So they were administering the roads. Route 11 out here was the Great Wagon Road. They had to take care of it. There were all sorts of other duties, and doing the work of justice. So Abraham was an original member of the county court. Thomas Marshall was the original county clerk. He's the father of Chief Justice Marshall from the later era. Jonathan Clark came from Caroline County to be the first deputy clerk, and Taverner Beale was the first county sheriff. I wonder how many of these names are familiar. All of them were prominent and important in local affairs, military affairs during the Revolution. All but Thomas Marshall were in the 8th Virginia Regiment. This guy, who knows who this guy is? Yeah, this is Lord Dunmore. Everybody should boo and hiss when you see his picture. He was the governor, kind of a jerk, and I'll have a little bit more to say about him. Events before the Revolution. Let me ask this. Who knows what happened on December 16th, 1773? Boston Tea Party. Okay? So when that happened, Parliament responded by blockading the port of the Boston Harbor. And everybody freaked out. The House of Burgesses in Williamsburg immediately passed a resolution declaring the effective day of the blockade as a day of fasting and prayer in Virginia. Dunmore didn't like that, and he dissolved the House of Burgesses. So they all walked across the street to Raleigh Tavern and organized a reverse boycott of British goods, suggested the First Continental Congress, and scheduled the first Virginia Convention, which was the sort of extra-legal, temporary revolutionary government of Virginia. So this is where I need volunteers. Now I saw one hand over there. Now you're a school teacher. Do you want to read? I don't know if people need their glasses or what, but you're not going to read the whole thing, I promise you.
Okay.
Anybody else? I need a couple more.
I can do that.
There you go. Tim, I know you can read.
I'll try my best.
Yeah. There you go. And anybody else? There we go. There you go. So what the Burgesses did when they met at the Raleigh Tavern is they said, okay, everybody go home and find out what people in your communities think we should do. And then we're going to reconvene on August 1st as the First Virginia Convention and take action. So what many counties did is they had meetings. Dunmore County had a meeting down in Woodstock. Abraham Bowman was there, and they passed a resolution. It has several parts to it, and I have an abbreviated introduction, which I may not read the whole thing of, but this was a declaration of rights for American citizens. The text of this, most of it was borrowed from Frederick County's resolution that they had just passed. But remember, 2 years ago, it was all one county. So it's not a surprise that they borrowed some of this. So let's do some reading here. So at a meeting of the freeholders and other inhabitants of the county of Dunmore, held at the town of Woodstock on the 16th day of June, 1774, to consider the best mode to be fallen upon to secure their liberties and properties, and also to prevent the dangerous tendency of an act of Parliament passed on the 14th year of the present Majesty's reign, to discontinue the shipping of goods within the harbor of Boston, evidently has to invade and deprive us of the same, the Reverend Peter Muhlenberg being voted moderator, a committee of the following gentlemen: the Reverend Muhlenberg, Francis Slaughter, Abraham Byrd, Taverner Beale, John Tipton, and Abraham Bowman were appointed to draw up resolves. After withdrawing for a short time, they returned with the following votes, which had been previously agreed to and voted by the freeholders and inhabitants of the county of Frederick. Would you read number 1, please?
I'm going to stand because I know my voice won't do it. Sorry, folks. Thank you.
Sure.
That we will always cheerfully pay due submission to such acts of government as His Majesty has a right by law to exercise over his subjects as sovereign to the British dominions, and to such only.
Who's got number 2?
That it is the inherent right of British subjects to be governed and taxed by representatives chosen by themselves only, and that every act of the British Parliament respecting the internal policy of North America is a dangerous and an unconstitutional invasion of our rights and privileges.
Number 3.
That the Act of Parliament above mentioned is not only itself repugnant to the fundamental laws of natural justice in condemning persons for a supposed crime unheard, but also a despotic exertion of unconstitutional power calculated to enslave a free and loyal people.
Number 4.
that the enforcing of the execution of the said act of Parliament by a military power will have a necessary tendency to raise a civil war, thereby dissolving that union which has so long happily subsisted between the mother country and her colonies, and that we will most heartily and unanimously concur with our suffering brethren of Boston and every other part of North America that may be the immediate victims of tyranny in promoting all proper measures to avert such dreadful calamities, to procure a redress of our grievances, and to secure our common liberties.
Number 5.
It is the unanimous opinion of this meeting that a joint resolution of all the colonies to stop all importations from Great Britain and exportations to it till the said act be repealed will prove the salvation of North America and her liberties. On the other hand, if they continue their imports and exports, there is the greatest reason to fear that power and the most odious oppression will rise triumphant over right, justice, social happiness, and freedom.
Fantastic. You guys are great. There's more to it. I didn't want to make you guys read the whole thing, but it's on my website if you want to read more of it. Okay. So after that, it was quite a while before the war started, and of course people didn't expect the war to start. So there were other things going on. In addition to the tension with Britain, there was tension in the West. And of course, as you know, Bowman spent the latter half of his life in the West, so we should talk about that just a little bit. After the French and Indian War, the king said, okay, nobody's allowed to settle west of the Allegheny Mountains because fighting with Indians is too expensive and problematic. Most of the people who fought in the French and Indian War thought that they were fighting to get the right to go west. So this was a big problem. And most of the West belonged to Virginia, at least in Virginia's opinion. So there was a treaty at Fort Stanwix in New York with the Iroquois, who claimed superiority, suzerainty, hierarchy over the Shawnee in the West, where they said, okay, we're going to move the border to essentially the Ohio River, which meant that Kentucky could be settled. So starting in 1768, Virginians start to move into Kentucky. The Shawnee, who lived in Ohio and hunted in Kentucky, didn't like it, and they didn't agree to the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. So tension is really brewing, and eventually led to a war called Lord Dunmore's War. There were really two main parts to it. One is the Wakatomika expedition, which was led by Angus MacDonald from Winchester. It appears that Abraham Bowman was part of that, apparently a captain under MacDonald in about July and August of 1774. And then the Battle of Point Pleasant was the major expedition in October of 1774. Then Abraham appears to have gone exploring or hunting. Some of you probably heard the term long hunter. The most famous one is Daniel Boone. Right, so these are guys who would go into Kentucky or into the West and just hunt for months. And they would collect deer skins, other kinds of skins, put them in giant bales, bring them back, and they're quite valuable, and send them to Europe. So he appears to have gone on one of these. The way we know is in 1847. There was a history of Kentucky written in 1847 where the author says that there were trees near Bowling Green, Kentucky, beech trees. If you ever notice when people carve their names into trees, it's always a beech tree because the bark is nice and smooth. 13 long hunters had carved their names into a tree near Bowling Green. And if you look here, it only gives the first initial and then the last name. There's an A. Bowman. That could be it could be Alfred Bowman, right? But we're pretty sure it's Abraham because there's also a J. Bowman, who would be John Bowman. We know that he was in Kentucky. And many of these names were quite prominent in Kentucky history. Some of them are pretty famous in that part of the world. Thomas Slaughter there was probably the brother of an 8th Virginia captain. Joseph Drake, who you see there, his brother was in the 8th Virginia Regiment. Isaac Height was Abraham's cousin, also a grandson of Yost Height. So these are not random people that you see here. Then, at about the same time, when it became clear that there might be some military activity, counties started forming independent companies. So these are just volunteer companies, right? These are not regular soldiers. They are not militia. They're not Minutemen. These are just sometimes called gentlemen volunteers. Just men got together and said, we're forming an independent company. The Dunmore Independent Company was formed in 1774. Abraham was a member of it. When the Williamsburg powder alarm happened in April 1775, you might know your history. Patrick Henry wanted to go get Dunmore and get the gunpowder back. He was talked down from that, but the Dunmore Independent Company started marching towards Winchester, and when the alarm was called off, they returned home and they went to Mr. Snap's house and had a barbecue instead. Now, I don't know if this house is the Snap house in Tom's Brook. My understanding is that this house dates to 1790. I think the back part, I think that's probably the old part. So this would not be the house where they had the barbecue. It might be in the same spot. Again, maybe someone here knows more about the house than I do. That house is important though. You see how the chimney comes out the middle of the roof rather than the edge? That is typical of German architecture. So this is a architecturally important house here in the valley. But yeah, Abraham was part of this aborted expedition to go get the gunpowder back. There was another place where they went to get gunpowder, and that was in Concord, Massachusetts, almost exactly on the same day, 2 days different. So the war had started when they had their barbecue. They just didn't know it yet. So once the war starts, the Virginia Convention authorizes a bunch of regiments. They got their numbers later. Counties were assigned a number of companies they had to raise, and then they were assigned to regiments. But ignoring that complication, the 8th Virginia Regiment was authorized. It was intended originally to be a quote-unquote German regiment. You will sometimes hear it referred to as the German Regiment. That was just an initial notion. It's called that in the Virginia Convention Journal, but it wasn't really called that afterwards. But the field officers who were appointed were German. That is a rarely seen early picture of Peter Muhlenberg there, dating from right after the war. You can see he's got 2 stars on his shoulder. That means he's a major general, a rank he got at the very end of the war as essentially a thank you for his service. And that's his signature at the top. So Peter Muhlenberg was the colonel. Abraham Bowman is the lieutenant colonel. It's a little hard to read, but it says there, Abraham Bowman, Lieutenant Colonel, 8th Virginia Regiment. And then Peter Helfenstein, a name that you may never have heard before, but should have. He was the major. So those are the 3 field officers. Peter was from Woodstock. Abraham was from Strasburg. And Peter was from Winchester. So this is the German part of the valley. And my theory is that the convention knew that there would be lots of Irish, or so-called Scotch-Irish, in the regiment, but they wanted to make darn sure they weren't running it. Because Scotch-Irish were not trusted. They were seen as a little bit radical. They were Presbyterian, right? So I think the elders in Williamsburg really wanted Germans in charge. Remember, even the king was German back then, right? The House of Hanover. And Lutheran and Anglican, there's not a whole lot of theological difference there. So I think they really wanted Germans in charge. So these guys are the field officers. You heard me mention Jonathan Clark earlier. I'm just going to remind you that he was from this county. And Richard Campbell, I think I mentioned earlier, he was from this county. They were the captains of the 2 companies that were raised in Dunmore County, which again is now Shenandoah County. We know that they were not just recruiting Germans because it says at the time that I forget which one's which, but one of those two captains was going to lead the English company and the other one was going to lead the German company. So even here in this county, which was supposedly so German, they had both kinds and they needed to organize it somehow. This is a little map that I drew of the recruiting zone for the 8th Virginia Regiment. It was the Virginia frontier, which at that time stretched all the way from Pittsburgh into Tennessee. People didn't quite know where the borders were, but there were Virginians settled in Pittsburgh and in Tennessee, and everything but Botetourt County produced at least one company for the 8th Virginia Regiment. You can see Dunmore County there sort of in the middle. Their first assignment was to go down to Norfolk and take care of Tories and try to catch slaves that were trying to escape their masters to go join Lord Dunmore's army. Then Major General Charles Lee came down, took command, and took them down to Charleston, South Carolina. They were at the Battle of Sullivan's Island in 1776, June 28th, 1776. This is a battle that is not as well known as it ought to be. It's early, it was important, it was an amazing victory. They were the South Carolina troops were in this half-finished fort built of palmetto wood, palm trees basically, double-walled, filled with sand. And because palmetto wood is soft, the cannonballs wouldn't shatter the wood. The walls just sort of absorbed the cannonballs. And they sustained a day-long cannonade. They themselves had some cannons and not a whole lot of ammo, so for every 10 cannonballs they were hit with, they would shoot one at these ships. And they ended up winning the battle. It's an amazing story. William Moultrie was the hero of that battle. The 8th Virginia was not there. They were on the other end of the island at what was called the Breach Inlet, where Charles Cornwallis was trying to lead an amphibious assault. They held him off. It's a little bit unclear exactly how much combat there was here. It's not well recorded. All the attention was focused on what happened at the fort. But it does appear from pension records that a number of 8th Virginia soldiers were here with South Carolinians, and that they did fight for several hours here. Then they celebrated the news of the Declaration of Independence under the Liberty Tree outside of Charleston. A big ceremony, a big event. I have an article on this on my website you should read. It's a pretty unique story. This was on August 5th. They didn't learn, news traveled slowly, right? They learned about it a month after it was announced in Philadelphia. By now, many of them are sick. They have malaria. Malaria is a disease that you can have a resistance to if you grow up in a place where it's endemic. It's not up here. And so these guys went down there with zero resistance to malaria, and a lot of them are quite sick, including Peter Helfenstein and Peter Muhlenberg. Helfenstein is so sick he resigns and returns to Winchester, where he slowly dies. He died in late in 1778 or 79. Left his family destitute. I don't think he ever had a stone marker, for example. 147 men were left in Charleston, too sick to move. When Charles Lee took them further south, they were going to invade Florida. St. Augustine was the capital of the province of East Florida, taken from the Spanish in the French and Indian War, and Lee was going to attack it. So they went down into Georgia. They got bogged down here at Sunbury. It's now a ghost town. Sunbury's long gone. But they were encamped here at a place that's now called Fort Morris. There was a fort built there about a year later. They spent the summer and fall of 1776 just dying. You know, there was an army there under Lee. It wasn't just the 8th Virginia. There were North Carolinians and South Carolinians. They were all sick. William Moultrie said that 15 men a day died. And it was pretty awful. It appears that Peter Muhlenberg stayed in Charleston, probably because he was sick. His family said that he died of lingering malaria decades later, so this would be when he got it. So it appears that Abraham was in charge here, at least for part of the encampment. He was asked at one point early in the fall, or I guess in October, to send a couple of ships or warboats down the river to protect the coast, and he responded that he really just couldn't. I have another thing I was going to ask somebody to read. I'm going to read this one. So this is a letter signed by Bowman and written on October 31st, and this gives you a little bit of a sense of the condition that they're in. It says, so Sunbury, October 31st, 1776. Sir, I received yours of yesterday a few minutes ago by express, and have endeavored to render the inhabitants of St. Simon's Island and the other islands to the southward all the assistance in my power by ordering Lieutenant Bacon down immediately in an armed boat, which is the only vessel at this place. It is with reluctance I inform you that were there more vessels here, it would not be in our power to man them, as almost all our men are sick and unfit for duty. I'm your obedient servant, Abraham Bowman, Lieutenant Colonel, 8th Virginia Regiment, and commanding officer at Sunbury. So they were not having a good time at Sunbury. North Carolina Brigadier General Robert Howe then gave him orders in December to head back north. I won't read this, but these are the orders. The operative sentence says, you are to proceed with the detachment now under your command by way of Augusta, so Augusta, Georgia, to Virginia, there to join your regiment. So in December they headed home. When they got home, they had lost a lot of soldiers from desertion and death. They had to recruit. They had a really hard time recruiting. At the beginning of the war, everybody was eager to sign up. Now people were not quite so eager. And then they went to New Jersey in the spring of '77, and for the first time ever, the entire regiment was in one place. They fought at the Battle of Brandywine. They fought at the Battle of Germantown. And then they encamped at Valley Forge. By now, the 2-year enlistments of all the original soldiers were almost up. In the spring of 1778, they were going to go home if they hadn't re-enlisted. So anybody who re-enlisted or anybody who was newly enlisted got to go home on furlough back here. Anybody whose enlistment was about to expire had to stay in Valley Forge. So I think a little bit of pressure to re-enlist, right? Bowman went home. Most of the officers went home. There really weren't that many men left because of events. So Bowman came back home here in February. Oh, here's a marker where they were encamped in Valley Forge. Those are my boys a few years ago. I told them to look fierce when I took the picture. I'll zoom in just a little bit. You can see Abraham Bowman's name here. It says right there, 8th Virginia Infantry, Colonel Abraham Bowman. So then at the end of the Valley Forge encampment, enlistments expired. Most of the men went home. The ones who'd been on furlough came back. The regiment was so weak now that it was merged with the 4th Virginia Regiment and the 12th Virginia Regiment in a provisional regiment that was known as the 4th, 8th, 12th Regiment. That unit fought at the Battle of Monmouth. After that, at White Plains, New York, they redid the entire Virginia line, and the 8th was permanently folded into the 4th Virginia Regiment. So that's the end of the 8th Virginia Regiment. It doesn't exist anymore. The 12th was renumbered the 8th, so there's a new 8th Virginia Regiment, but that's an entirely different unit. And Bowman was a colonel, but he now had no command. He went back home to Virginia, and met with Governor Patrick Henry and said, you know, I want to keep fighting, give me a job. But there really wasn't one for him at that time. So that was the end of his service as a soldier in the Revolutionary War. John Bowman, his brother, who I mentioned earlier, was already in Kentucky. And had established a small settlement known as Bowman Station. A station is like a little fortified community, and most of the early settlements in Kentucky are known as stations. This is John Bowman's house. It doesn't exist anymore. Well, I guess it does. It was torn down or disassembled and moved to another location somewhere in Kentucky, I think about 1780. But this is a double pen log house. I don't know much about it, but one of those two halves might have been John Bowman's house in the 1770s, and Abraham lived there for a few years after he moved there with he led 30 families to settle in Kentucky in the winter of 1779-1780, and he lived there at Bowman Station for a few years. So that might be his home. Don't know. Since I have them, I'll just show you a couple neat pictures. That's inside. You can see the stone fireplace was falling apart. You can see the construction of the walls. I want to find out more about this. So he's now living in Kentucky, and many of his siblings are there, including his sister Elizabeth, older sister who married Captain Isaac Ruddle. There was a Ruddle's station not far from Bowman Station. It was attacked in 1780 by Indians. 470 settlers were taken captive and taken north to Detroit and northern Indiana, including the Ruddle family. They were separated. Abraham Ruddle, who was Abraham Bowman's namesake and nephew, was 5. He was adopted into a Shawnee Indian family along with another brother and was not released until about 1794. He couldn't even speak English at that point. So he had been fully absorbed into the Indian ways of living. The Battle of Blue Licks was an important battle of the Revolution in Kentucky that people don't hear much about unless they live in Kentucky. Some people call it the last war of the Revolutionary War. I mean the last battle of the Revolutionary War. It appears that Abraham was engaged in this battle. He didn't serve as an officer. He was out of the army. It was just anybody with a rifle just, stood up and joined the fight. Here is a memorial or a monument to the men who died in that battle. His name is on it right there. But nobody's ever connected the dots between our Abraham Bowman and this name. He's listed as, a private or an enlisted guy, just because I think they didn't know any more about him. I've corresponded with the director of the park, and he agrees with me that it's probably the Abraham Bowman, but more research is needed on that. And then after this period, he had acquired some land up near Lexington. So he moved up there, and his log house is still there. And it has been nicely restored. It's a unique house. It's a unique log house in that it has a basement, which is very unusual for a log cabin or a log house. It has a second floor, which is not that unusual, but it has an exterior stairway to get up there. So it's a neat building. It is on a big horse farm now that is owned by the Emir of Dubai. So when I went to visit it, they had those electric gates that opened, and I came in and there was a security box there and I had to check in and all this stuff. But the upside of him owning the property is that he's got limitless money and he fixed it up. If you want to get an idea how badly it needed to be fixed up, I will show you this picture from the 70s. So it really needed to get fixed up. I love this picture because it's got the big wheels. You remember big wheels? Parked out front. So Bowman lived outside of Lexington for the rest of his life. He lived in this house first. There may have been a second house that doesn't exist anymore. Not sure about that. And I have a theory that he may have been the last, or maybe one of the last surviving colonels from the Revolutionary War. He lived to be quite old. He didn't get too involved in politics, but he nevertheless had stature that made him important politically. Henry Clay, here on the left, was embroiled in big controversy after the presidential election of 1824. He was a candidate. Nobody won the Electoral College, so it was decided by the House of Representatives in Washington. And he supported John Quincy Adams. And he was accused of doing so in exchange for becoming Secretary of State, which created a big controversy. He denied it. John Quincy Adams denied it. Andrew Jackson continued to accuse him of it because he lost. In 1824, Henry Clay returned home to Kentucky, and there was a big event to sort of celebrate him and defend his honor. And Bowman was the he convened the event. He was the main speaker at that event. And then on the right, that is the Marquis de Lafayette. Some of you probably know that he was invited by President Madison at the time of the 50th anniversary of the Revolutionary War to return to America to celebrate the, what is that, a semi-centennial? He was the last surviving general from the Continental Army, and he did this grand tour that took months and months. He went to every state all around America. Huge crowds came out to greet him. He was sort of the first superstar celebrity in American history. And when he came to Lexington, it was Abraham Bowman who did the formal greeting and read the speech and all of that. So he was a big deal. This is a house that is believed to have been his. He either built it and lived in it at the very end of his life, or maybe he started building it and his son finished it after he died, or maybe his son just built it. It's not really that clear. But this is a real southern plantation house. It's big. Look at that grand driveway. Just imagine what this place looked like in its prime. It's now a little bit worn down. It's across the street from the log house that I showed you earlier. Here's a close-up of it. It is called Cedar Hall, I think. And then he died in 1848, which is pretty late, right? I mean, that's a long time after the 1837. That's a long time after the Revolutionary War. That's why I sort of think he might be the last surviving colonel from the Continental Army. His wife lived several years longer. He is buried in Lexington Cemetery. I'm glad to say that the SAR does a really nice job taking care of his grave. They have events there on key holidays, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, put flags there. They recently cleaned it. It needed to be cleaned. So, you know, he's far away from where he grew up, but he should be celebrated here because he led a very consequential life, and he was a local boy. As you know, he grew up on Bowman's Mill Road here in Strasburg. He also lived on Bowman's Mill Road in Kentucky. He had a mill himself. So it's kind of fun that there are two roads with the same name in the two places. So that's what I've got. Thank you all.
Questions or anything? I'm forgetting Charlie. Anybody have any questions? Comments?
Yes, sir.
John Height house that was being, I guess, demolished or torn or moved. What period was that picture taken from?
I'm sorry, which picture?
John Height.
Oh, John Bowman house.
John Bowman house.
So I can answer this if I look it up. I think it was 1980, from memory. It was about that time period.
And what happened to it?
So I emailed the Mercer County Historical Society asking what the deal was with the house, and they said it was disassembled and moved to the next county south. And they offered to tell me more if I paid a researcher $15 an hour, which I might do. Because I really want to know, but I haven't done it yet. So log houses are like Lincoln logs. You know, they can be disassembled and reassembled. So it happens quite a bit, actually. So who else has a question?
There's not any gaps in your stories. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah.
So this is Abraham, the older brother of Isaac. In your research with Abraham, did you find any more information about Isaac? He was taken captive and ended up back at Bowman's 40 years later.
I believe I remember that. So I knew there was going to be somebody here who knew more than me about some of this. But yeah, no, there were a bunch of kids, and there are stories connected with all of them. And yeah, I think that's in the way. There's a John Walter Wayland book about the Bowman family, which I recommend to you. It sounds like maybe you've read that or an excerpt from it. But yeah, I don't know much about that story, but I read that once too.
Did I tweak interest?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
When they disassemble, like the log house, does the history go with the log house that people would keep that history?
Well, you know, I don't know. I mean, it would be up to somebody in the local community to make an effort to document and write things down and remember. And I don't, in that instance, I just don't know enough to answer your question in that instance. What I will say is that, you know, Bowman was a big deal, Abraham, but he wasn't as a big deal in Kentucky as his brother John. And, you know, things get forgotten or ignored, and, you know, a lot of this stuff, people don't, like, you know, for instance, Abraham Bowman's name being engraved in that monument at Blue Licks. You know, I don't think anybody's connected those dots. They just don't really, you know, he's just some guy named Abraham Bowman. Other people know that he was a colonel in the Continental Army, but I don't think people have connected those dots. And the same thing might happen with the house. You know, it's just, I'm sure they know it's an old log house. But yeah, somebody needs to write that down. Yes, ma'am.
Just that Fort Bowman is owned by Bell Grove.
Yes.
And they did dendroarchaeology there and determined that it was, I think it was built around 1771.
Right.
And as you said, during the French and Indian War, it was actually a previous building.
Right.
So anyway, they kind of narrowed that down.
Yeah, that's good to know. I didn't know the 1771 date, but I did. Well, yeah, it's a good thing that we have science to help us answer some of these questions, because traditions sometimes get changed in the retelling. For instance, Abraham Ruddle, the boy that was captured by Indians, if you read his obituary from the Arkansas newspaper, where he lived his last days, they have him as being, like, you know, Chief Tecumseh's best friend. I mean, all this amazing. It's not true. Anybody else?
Yeah, what prompted your interest in the 8th Virginia Bowman?
So, thanks for that. I've been interested in the Revolutionary War forever. I'm exactly the right age to have been an impressionable young boy when the bicentennial happened, right? There was a little Revolutionary War graveyard up the road from my house when I was a kid. I have 4 ancestors who fought in the Revolution. One of them was a Tory, and a really bad one. So, but the other 3 were great. One of my ancestors was in the 8th. He was in one of the companies from Pittsburgh. And the connection between most of the soldiers immigrated down the wagon road from Pennsylvania. Being from Pennsylvania, I like the connection between Pennsylvania and Virginia. But it's just, you know, it was a bit of an interest at one point, and I read more and more, and it became an obsession, just like any hobby, right? So, anything else I can tell you or answer? Yes, ma'am.
I grew up in Clary, and that's where the Miller House was. My mother knew the man that had the Bible. She asked him to give it. I remember telling him to give it to St. Paul's. He gave it to First National Bank. And then it went to am I correct, the museum then?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was an old man, never married or anything. Am I correct on everything? All that?
Well, I got to tell you, when I went in there and these guys let me look at it, I don't mean to talk over people. Was there an additional thing?
They were agreeing with it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I got to tell you, when I walked into the museum and they let me take a look at that Bible, I was just, you know, I'd read the story and I knew that it existed somewhere. And, you know, I felt like Nicolas Cage in National Treasure getting a look at that thing.
Yeah, I don't think your feet touched the floor. there, you were just like flying around. I mean, I can tell it since the passion on your face.
Yeah.
The way she was there. But I do want to reiterate that please go to his website because as he mentioned, he referenced a couple times about the research he has. You can read more in depth about it. He does a great job in research, just by visiting the site. And also, you have links to the video. Again, I know the one that you shared with Dennis and I at the time. There's also some great videos as well. So, again, there's more to the story kind of to say.
Yeah.
You go to his website. Like I say, he's always adding content. So it's definitely worth visiting without a doubt. Last call for any questions before I wrap up and start getting sweet and salty goodies.
Well,
real quick,
Yeah.
I do want to say a couple of things. Of course, we're celebrating our 250th in Shenandoah County, so there's some more events throughout the year, so make sure you take advantage of those. And I do want to mention this as well, since we've got so many history lovers in here. Shenandoah County Public Schools is actually writing a new 5th grade curriculum right now, and it's all about Shenandoah County. So I'm so awesomely excited about that because we kind of lost our local history when it comes to when the standards of learning kind of came along, for all you all to know that, and it was behind our heads. So we were so excited when we got the green light to go ahead and write your own history. So we've really gone out and got a lot of content, but one thing that came up during our discussions was inviting people to come in to the local schools up and down the county and just sharing stories and stuff. And I said, well, reach out because I've got a lot of people that can share great stories when it comes down to Shenandoah County, and then also concentrating locally on your local community, your towns and things like that. So that's another great opportunity that I'm really excited about. So we might be reaching out to you all. Again, it'll be this upcoming school year, will be the first year we'll be doing that. But again, it'll continually grow as we're writing the curriculum moving forward. And so, is there any other announcements we have to make? Any other upcoming dates or anything anyone's aware of? Remember, board members, we need to have a short little meeting once we're done here with our little fellowship. And Gabe, any final comments on your part?
no, just thanks very much for inviting me. I enjoy this.
All right, the here in the back, there's drinks, everything. Please stick around.